Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome. Before we start anything at all, could I politely ask you to switch your mobile phones off, please? Most of you are probably familiar with the format of the evening by now, the Public Occasion Agency. For those of you who are not, in essence, we are a student-run agency that stages public events at the AA and around the AA. These events also exist in a written form, in a preview document which is circulating in the room, and later on in a commissioned review. These two documents will collide in the POA book later in the year. This academic year, for this academic term, we are staging 4 events, of which tonight is the second one. Last week we had Patrick Wright, who gave a fantastic talk on architectural and both political masquerades, entitled On Living Behind Facades. Then we are collaborating with Sam Hardingham in the staging of Wish We Were Here, which will be an exhibition on Cedric Price. And on the 4th of March we all hope to see you at the opening, for which Fergus Henderson will present a specially commissioned CP Savory treat. Then on the 18th of March we'll have the scientist Angelo Merlino of the Swiss Institute CERN with us to discuss our understanding of the universe on the basis of the Large Hadron Collider. And then for our last event on the 22nd of March, we've invited Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Marcus Miesen and Armin Linke to explore the potential of the archive as a productive space of conflict. Tonight we are absolutely delighted to have Anna Minton with us. We had scheduled Anna last year, but unfortunately that had to be cancelled. So on the second things worked out and we are very happy. Anna is a writer and a journalist and the author of Ground Control, the book which will, after the lecture, be for sale by the AA bookshop here in the front. The book is entitled Ground Control, Fear and Happiness in the 21st Century. It's published by Penguin. Anna is also the author of Joseph Rowntree Foundation's Viewpoint on Fear and Distrust, and she is a member of the writers panel for the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. Sorry, this is... Okay, sorry for that. She also appears regularly on television and radio, and she's a contributor to The Guardian and the New Statesman. Tonight, Anna will ask the question, why is fear of crime soaring, although crime itself continues to fall? I'm personally very keen, after having read the book as well. Please join me in welcoming Anna Minton to the AA.
Okay, is that better? Right. I'm going to talk about my book, published 18 months ago. Towards the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about the current context we find ourselves in, which is a little changed from when I was writing the book. But the main themes, I think, still pertain, despite changing governments, changing political situations. So this is the book, Ground Control. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a writer and a journalist. My background is as a journalist. This is my first book, but my training is as an investigative journalist. And what I was trying to do with this book is take an investigative approach to what are often very specialist subject areas and try to explode what I thought was a very important debate and bring it into the mainstream. Topics like planning, housing, architecture, design, These are vital topics to the way that we live today, but so often they're just mired in jargon and they're really totally inaccessible for the lay person. Debates about Section 106 and various other sort of terminologies which just sort of seem to exclude people. And really what I was trying to do was link these areas in a multidisciplinary way, because something else I think we've suffered from so much is having silos of architecture doesn't link with antisocial behavior, doesn't link with crime, doesn't link with planning, and bring all of these together and really sort of try to explain why this is so vital to the way we live, the way we experience our cities, the way we feel about ourselves in our cities. Because at the end of the day, what I'm writing about, I think these are emotional topics. So I'm trying to link our sense of place with the way we feel about ourselves, but also to maintain the rigor of these academic disciplines. So that was my challenge, not to compromise the rigor there. The key themes I'm going to be talking about tonight, the key themes throughout the book, underpinning the whole topic is post-industrial change. This post-industrial change which has happened over the last generation, and the new economy that it's given rise to, the new economy of the globalized financial services industries, and the landscape that that has created, the increasingly polarized cities that has resulted, and what's often called the two-speed economy. I'm going to be talking a lot about regeneration, this notion of regeneration. It's a word that we've heard a lot about over the last decade or so. I'm going to be talking about identity in places, and this feeling that everywhere has come to look the same. Why is that? Why are places so much more sterile than they used to be? Why is every high street so similar no matter where you are? I'm going to be talking about exclusion and inclusion, and I'm trying to lead up to an argument that I'm making about how this city that we're living in today has created this culture of fear and a so-called crime complex in contemporary society. And what I'm trying to argue is that this culture of fear has been created by a lack of trust and a lack of cohesion in cities. So in so doing, I'm trying to link it with this wider debate which has been popular recently around the economics of happiness and well-being. And now well-being has been adopted by every politician of whatever political hue. And I think David Cameron's recently introduced a well-being index. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to link the way we live in our cities, what we decide in planning departments, and how that actually relates to our happiness and our own mental health. So as I said, the context is this enormous level of post-industrial regeneration opportunity that we've seen over the last 15 years. It's a level of change that the UK has not witnessed since the 1950s and the 1960s. And that was the modernist planning moment, when tower blocks and arterial roads sliced through Britain's cities, and planners thereafter were tarred with a sort of with quite a bad reputation, which they took years to recover from. But the 50s and 60s was this famous time of construction in Britain. And I think what we've seen recently over the last decade is, again, we've had this huge moment. It's a postmodern construction moment. But what I'm trying to argue is that this has been fueled very much by policy change, particularly in planning policies and particularly in local democracy, how local authorities have interacted with their communities. What has happened is not some sort of economic inevitability, simply the onward march of globalization. It's something which has been almost deliberate on the part of our policymakers, who have actually imported one American policy towards British cities after another. And I'm trying to argue that the importing of all those policies has created this landscape that we're going to discuss. Since I wrote the book, however, there has been, the context has changed, and I'll talk about that towards the end of the talk. So this slide I've picked here to illustrate this new post-industrial context of the last 15 years or so. This is, in fact, the centre of Liverpool. before Liverpool 1, the huge development there was built in a couple of years ago. This was an enormous construction site, and every British city, every town and city witnessed these construction sites, large and small. Wherever you were. I mean, going up to Manchester when I was researching the book, you know, literally you step off the plane and it was just the sound of pneumatic drills everywhere and cranes everywhere. You know, there was so much construction going on in the property boom years. What I'm arguing in the book is that this construction was creating a certain kind of city, what I'm calling the privatised city. It's a very different kind of city to the city that we have all grown, well, that I certainly grew up with. This slide is a little, it's a relatively small site compared to Liverpool 1, which I just showed you earlier. That's 43 hectares, 34 streets in the heart of Liverpool, all of which are privately owned by the Duke of Westminster and privately controlled and policed by private security. I'll talk about all of this in a minute. This is a much smaller place. This is called Cardinal Place, and it's just behind Victoria Station. So really I'm trying to illustrate that, you know, whether it's little pockets or whether it's the centre of a city, the template in every single regeneration scheme, and when I give these talks I say, you know, if you can come up with one which is different, please do tell me. The template has always been on this privately owned model, which creates a very different type of city. There are two models here which are fueling the privatised city, which overlap. On the one hand, we've got these privately owned places like Liverpool 1 or Cabot Circus in Bristol or High Cross in Leicester, or the smaller schemes like Cardinal Place or Regent's Place in London. And these are all very similar to what I'd call the Canary Wharf model. But alongside these, we've also got privately managed or privately controlled places on a business improvement district model. And while the land and the streets beneath your feet may in fact still be owned, as it were, by the local authority, they are managed, controlled by a private company. And all of this is creating a very different idea of the city. It's looking at place primarily as a product to be bought and sold. And it's not as democratic, I would argue, and it segregates parts of the city into separate enclaves. And a really big point that I always want to make when I'm talking about this is that this idea of the private ownership of the streets is new. It's only been going on here for the last 10 years or so. And people very often say, well, look, you know, if Grosvenor, the Duke of Westminster's property company, is going to plough £1 billion into the centre of Liverpool, isn't it fair enough that he gets to own the streets? I mean, you know, surely that's a reasonable sort of trade-off. And in fact, this is to miss the point, really, because the private sector has been investing quite happily, well, until the financial crisis, in regeneration without requiring the private ownership of the streets. This is not at the behest of developers and the private sector. It's in fact completely a policy-driven phenomenon, and one that I would argue doesn't need to happen. And in fact, that seems to be what our policymakers have also been, some of them, deciding. But we'll come on to that towards the end of the talk. So it's this private ownership of the street. It sort of happened quietly. You know, we sort of walked into it. It sort of happened almost by stealth. But I'd argue that, you know, it's something that has no raison d'etre. We really don't need it to be this way. This slide is Cabot Circus in Bristol, another of these very, very large schemes. And the point about them very often is that, you know, wherever you are, there's nothing to tell you if you're in Cabot Circus that you're actually in Bristol. There's nothing to tell you if you're in Liverpool 1 that you're in Liverpool. These places all seem remarkably similar wherever they are. They're very sort of, they're not dissimilar from airport departure lounges, I would say. They're the non-places of Marc Auguet, the French sociologist. I probably mispronounced his name. They're not connected to their surrounding environment, to the local culture and the local community around them. So what's really been fueling these places, I've been making a big point about policy playing a key role, but really it's the economic model which has been fueling the growth of these places. And this is so-called property-led or retail-led regeneration, which aims first and foremost to treat place as a product and to create the maximum profit out of places, raise land values as much as possible. What the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre said 40 years ago, he predicted that if you treat place purely as a product, it means that everywhere will come to look the same. And that's why we've got this phenomenon of all these clone towns that people are complaining about, these non-places where the high street, wherever you are, looks the same. So it's driven by this aim of keeping property prices and land values high. And the difference is that this this has actually been enshrined in planning legislation, as I'll come on to say in a minute, where in fact the notion of the public good, which was the benchmark test for whether or not certain policies could go forward, certain planning policies could go forward, this notion of the public good was replaced by economic benefit. So it's a very different way of looking at the city. It's a sort of this best value. How can we get the most value out of the place rather than what's going to be in the public interest? Just to recap, these private places, virtually all new development follows this model. It's characterized by private security guards, defensible architecture, and CCTV covering every inch of the site, as I was proudly told in Liverpool 1. And there's a checklist of rules and regulations of what is not allowed. So no skateboarding, no cycling, no rollerblading, no taking photographs. Photographers are always at the vanguard of this, actually, and they're always asking me to speak at their events because they're the people who are constantly being told that they can't take photographs. The photographer who, in fact, took the pictures for my book, we wanted him to go to one of these big places, one of these private places at Paddington Waterside, and he went along and he was asked he could only take pictures if my publisher could get permission from the estate's manager. So I discussed this with the estate's manager, and the estate's manager said, we will only grant you permission if your book can guarantee that that it will show the development in a favorable light. So it's a completely different way of looking at places where, you know, so the photographer was only allowed to use the image of the place in a PR sort of a way. But very importantly, no political demonstrations are allowed in these places, no handing out of political leaflets. So it's an entirely different way of looking at the city, and I would say one that creates a very different public culture, and one which creates a more sterile environment and a more fearful environment, and I'd say a less happy one. So policy, the key thing. And underlying so much of this have been rather obscure to anyone who's not in the know. For this audience, you are probably relatively familiar with planning and compulsory purchase policy. This has been absolutely critical in assembling these enormous sites. So that's 170 acres in Stratford City, 43 acres 43 hectares in Liverpool. And what was critical but barely noticed at the time was a change to the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act of 2005. And that change, that's when this concept of the public good was taken out of that legislation and was replaced with economic benefit as the benchmark test for whether or not compulsory purchase to create these huge sites could get the go-ahead. That was a hugely important change in legislation, and one, in fact, which was mirrored in the US as well. And over there, compulsory purchase is called eminent domain. And in fact, in the US, this change, very similar, public good substituted for economic benefit, it caused a Supreme Court case, which became very well known, and in fact was headline news. It was across all the news bulletins, books were written about it, and protesters actually camped on the White House lawn, so it was huge. I mean, over here, you know, I have yet to come across someone who noticed it. But in the US, it was absolutely huge, and the former President George Bush intervened personally, and many states, planning policy is federal over there, many states actually revoked it. So what a contrast. I mean, what I was finding in the book is that we have copied so many American policies, but actually we very often, for a number of reasons, have taken them a lot further. So planning policy has been absolutely central to this. So if you come to think at the end of my talk, well, you know, a lot of these changes are incredibly concerning, bear in mind the devil is in the detail of planning policy, and it's only through planning policy that things can be altered. And as I'll tell you in a little bit more detail at the end, in fact, Boris Johnson, to my amazement, has come to this conclusion himself, and he has written a new strategy for public space in London, where he has said he doesn't want streets to be privatised henceforth. This is another little development in Liverpool again. It's not Liverpool 1, which is the whole of the centre of the city. It's another much smaller one called East Village here. And you find very often that these places have these very sort of American names, like, you know, East Village and the West One, and, you know, this and that. The funniest of all, I thought, was in Manchester, where York Street actually changed its name to New York Street. And very often, they're all character. You get these bollards, which will delineate the private space from the street outside. And there's probably a little sign there which says private property and some of the things which you're not allowed to do. So, yeah, large and small, you know, where this is the sort of model. So what I'm also saying in the book is that what we've come to see is that we're actually recreating what seemed to be very similar to Victorian patterns of land ownership. Over the last 150 years, the city streets have seen a diverse patchwork of ownership. The local authority will own some premises and properties, private individuals will own some, and institutional investors will own some. And now what you're seeing is these enormous places which are owned by one individual private landlord, in a not dissimilar way to the older aristocrats of pre-Victorian England who parcelled up large tracts of the city. So in fact, the only remaining one who's still very powerful in property is the Duke of Westminster. But back then, we had also the Duke of Bedford, who probably owned exactly where we are today. And so London was parcelled up into these different ownerships. I mean, what I'm saying in the book is that this undermines the diversity of the city, and it's a far less democratic way of conducting city life. But then people say to me, well, you know, some of these places are some of our finest squares, you know, they're the most wonderful part of our urban fabric and our urban heritage. And in fact, I'm not quite sure, this slide, which I always show, could in fact be right here. Yeah. So that's quite apt. And, you know, of course, they're absolutely right. These wonderful Georgian terraces and squares were all owned by individual private landlords in the way that I'm just, you know, I have been condemning. But what we don't see in this slide, what we don't experience when we come to the Architectural Association, is that in fact this was all a very heavily gated and fortified environment with sentry boxes and security guards, and in fact it was entirely different from the feel that's been created today. Oh, whoops! No, I'll. What actually happened as local government grew in power in the Victorian period, and local democracy sort of rose in power, actually we started to see large-scale protests against the gating and the private ownership of the streets, which resulted in two parliamentary inquiries during the mid-19th century against the closure of such large tracts of the city to the general public. So, I mean, when 150 years ago or so, you couldn't come here unless you in fact lived here or you were invited here. So these large public inquiries, which were reflected in considerable public protest, gathered pace over the course of the 19th century, and in fact by the end of the 19th century, Parliament passed an act which said that henceforth the streets and public places of the city could not remain in private ownership and had henceforth to be adopted. This is the terminology, had to be adopted by the local authority. So from around the end of the 19th century, it became standard practice for local authorities to adopt, i.e. control, the streets, and that's the sort of environment we've all become used to and take for granted, that the streets are public because they have always been public. Well, they weren't always public, but they have been public for an awful long time, about 100, you know, until certainly, you know, our great-grandparents' time. But what we're seeing now is that this process is reversing, and this new type of private landlord is in fact mirroring this pre-democratic period before local government rose in power. So that's a very central point reflecting the dilution of democracy in the city. I just want to read out this little text, because I think it's a very good way of encapsulating the atmosphere of what I'm talking about. And it's from the architect Adam Caruso, who I'm sure lots of you are familiar with. So he said, "While planning authorities may argue about facade materials and the survival of medieval street plans in the master plan, several city blocks that once housed thousands of tenants and was in the ownership of hundreds are now controlled by one owner backed by international finance institutions. Do not be fooled by the medieval street pattern, the well-maintained squares, the lunchtime activities. These developments constitute a serious erosion of democracy in the public realm. This process is taking place all over London and in all major cities." And in fact, he wrote this in 2003, when only people like him, you know, who were sort of actually tapped into this through their work, were aware of the trends, because as we all know, regeneration takes an awful long time to come on stream. But how much more is it taking place today? So we've discussed private places. As I said, there are two models which overlap, and the other model is business improvement districts, so the private management of places. I prefer to use the word control, because management is a sort of, I don't know, it's one of those words that doesn't really mean what it really says. You know, you actually want to know who's in charge of a place. Management is a rather sort of distant sort of a word. What we've basically done is we have imported business improvement districts, which is an American policy, which is in fact very controversial, again, in America, just as these changes to planning legislation were very controversial. Over there, bids are seen by a lot of protesters as, again, undermining local democracy. Basically, an area is represented by a profit-driven organization which represents local businesses rather than residents and democratically elected representatives. But over here, again, their introduction was hardly noticed, and we now have 95 or so up and running. The new West End company in the West End, CV1 in Coventry, Cityco in Manchester. They're all over the country, and they operate in a very similar way to the private places. They have private security guards, CCTV, the same raft of rules and regulations, and a very similar feel and culture, I would say. You know, this sort of more sterile sort of environment. How do they operate? Well, basically, local businesses tend to be retailers, pay a tax, or you could say a service charge, to the bid organization, the bid company, and the bid company then carries out the improvements to the area that those local businesses would like to see. So everything is run according, it becomes a very sort of shopping mall type model, and in fact in the States critics call these places malls without walls. And the key principles which underpin bids, the sort of the guiding principle, is called clean and safe. Which in fact means lots of sanitation and very high levels of security. And these principles actually come straight from the New York Mayor's office. Clean and safe is at the foot of a pyramid, and then marketing and branding are next, and the management pyramid goes up, and creating a memorable experience is at the top. So we've basically imported these guidelines, lock, stock and barrel, from New York. And these places very much overlap with the private parts of the city, because very often a bid organisation might in fact manage a private development. So it's very hard to know who runs what, which blurs democratic accountability even further. So, I mean, what on earth's the problem with that? You know, I mean, who wouldn't want the city to be clean and safe? It sounds like a very good idea. Well, it's a very good narrative, but in fact it's not so simple, because clean and safe really means very high levels of security. And as I'm going to argue in a moment, I think actually it's all the security which is causing, which is in fact behind our increased fear of crime. So what you see in these places is lots of visible uniform private security and this sort of pristine cleanliness. I talked to a developer who was working on the Stratford City, the Westfield Stratford City development, and he told me actually what he hoped from Stratford City is that it would become, that the streets of Stratford City would come up to the standards of any office lobby, which I just thought was a quite bizarre aspiration for a central part of, you know, almost the inner city. I mean, you know, this state-of-the-art, sort of tens of thousands of pounds spent on this cleaning equipment, and you know, it's what you actually see is very often is that it can clean out the people and create a rather soulless feeling. So here's a security guard in Canary Wharf. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about the impact of security now, because that's at the center, really, of what I'm trying to say. Policy, again, what we saw was some very significant changes to security policy, policing policy, with the Police Reform Act in 2002, which introduced this concept of the wider police family of wardens, rangers, ambassadors, these uniformed officials who do have certain powers to issue fines, and you know, certainly they can stop you and ask you what you're doing. And what I would argue is that, in fact, rather than making us feel safer, this increases fear. And in a way, that seems to be a no-brainer, because the presence of private security is obviously a reminder of possible danger. But there is a real conundrum here, because if you ask people, you know, what would you like? Would you like more security? Invariably, people would say, people do say yes, because they believe it will do what it says on the tin. But actually, research shows that if you ask them after the security measures have been introduced, they do not say they feel safer. This slide is a bit of a spoof. It's actually in More London, which is a privately owned, it's a business improvement district and a privately owned place, I think. And ironically enough, it's where the Greater London Authority is situated. The seat of democratic government in London. And the architecture magazine Blueprint did a bit of a spoof here, where they decided to have a picnic in More London, and this is basically what happened, because of course you can't do things like that within the More London area. I mean, one of the key problems with this high level of security is basically it undermines the capacity of people to just stroll around and sort of linger. Some research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found that what was really important in vibrant public spaces was to allow people to just do nothing. And this tendency instead to micromanage activities is just totally not compatible with this idea of doing nothing. You know, if you're just sort of passing the time of day, browsing, window shopping, waiting for a friend, and a private security guard just taps you on the shoulder and asks you, you know, are you okay? I mean, in the guise of being helpful. It's not a sort of lingering sort of experience. In fact, that happened to me at the South Bank the other day when I was waiting for a friend. You know, it just changes the atmosphere. I'm going to also talk a little bit about the spread of security in other contexts as well. And this is the sort of ubiquitous gated community, which has become very familiar over the last few years. All these all these flats which have gone up in city centres all over the country, and invariably you get the gates and the guards and the CCTV. It's just become the standard way we build places now. It's expected. I've put this slide here because it illustrates, I want to just very quickly talk about something called secured by design that some of you are probably familiar with, and the rise of secured by design as this central, basically in all our public buildings, particularly our schools and our hospitals, secured by design really rules now. So you can see this this green space here. It's basically got it's ticked all its secured by design boxes because it's got this this little sort of, you know, fence around it, and which I would sort of say makes it a rather miserable looking piece of green space with no one in it. But, you know, you have to basically tick all your secured by design boxes to get planning permission now. So secured by design is one of these policies which has sort of crept in again by stealth, and in fact a lot of people are increasingly uncomfortable with it, but it's there, and it's, you know, I think we need to start talking about its impact. I mean, this is a slide from Salford where I spent some time with some young people up there, and very, very deprived community up there. You know, you can see the sort of not, you know, very run-down parade of shops, but they've got their secured by design. So, you know, you can see these spikes on the top of this gate. And it's this sort of thing, you know, which just adds to this increasingly oppressive urban environment, I would say. In the book, I also dealt with housing a lot, and I talked about housing policies in the north of England. And I'm just going to very quickly show you these slides because, well, I think they're some of the most emotive pictures in the book. But I looked at housing policy because I wanted to talk about how land values and looking at place as a product was absolutely central to other aspects of the way we live in the city as well. So I looked at this policy called Pathfinder, where thousands of homes in terrace properties like this in the north of England have been demolished and people have been cleared from their homes. It's been a terrible but very distressing policy, which we may now have seen the back of. But again, it just shows this sort of whole approach at looking at places purely as products. And I think that was one of the most sort of, that was one of the best images in the book, so that's why I've put that there. But I'll come back to my central argument for tonight. What I'm trying to say really is that this city that we've created with these privatised city centres and all this high security, this new way of looking at the city which segregates it more and isn't for the benefit of place. What I'm trying to say is that this is in fact creating an atmosphere of far greater fear and distrust. And at the centre of that is that basically, if you introduce all this security, you're actually removing our personal and our collective responsibility for our own safety. This concept, which was famously introduced by Jane Jacobs, of natural surveillance, the unconscious interactions between strangers walking down the street, which just naturally keeps places safe. You, in fact, by putting all this CCTV and private security guards, you're removing that from the environment, and in so doing, you're actually diluting trust between people. So that's a sort of very, very central point, I think, for why we need to be very wary of all this, of the takeover of security. But what's behind all this? Well, I mean, basically, you know, these policies were not introduced perniciously by a government who was sort of, you know, trying to act against people's interests. I mean, they were responding to a really genuine fear. We've got this big problem in this country, mirrored in the States. Only in the US and in the UK have we got this paradox that while crime has been going down steadily since 1995, fear of crime has soared. And I really looked into this carefully because I thought, I can't talk about this if I'm not 100% sure about my facts and figures. And in fact, crime, including violent crime, has gone down, although you would never think it from the way it's reported. I mean, you might remember a year or two ago when there was a spate of stabbings in London, and it seemed that almost every day you would read about a knife homicide in the Evening Standard. What you never heard was that, in fact, although stabbings had gone up by 5 or 6 that year, which is a lot, the amount of gun crime homicides had actually declined by the same level, which left us actually exactly as we were the previous year. But the way this is reported leads to a very, very different picture. So, of course, the media is very much to blame for that, but I don't think that's the only reason. I think this city that we're creating is also very much part of why we're stoking this culture of fear. And really, our problem is that our solutions, the solutions we're putting in place to reassure people are very much part of the problem. We've got 4.2 million CCTV cameras in the UK, which is more than in all of Europe put together. And we are constantly introducing new innovations. So these are the CCTV cameras that you're all very familiar with. But every day we're seeing sort of something new. You've probably seen this little Dalek car which patrols around. It's a CCTV car. And this device is called the Mosquito, which you may have heard of. It emits a high-pitched whine which only pierces the ears of people under 25, because I think hearing changes and you hear at a different frequency if you're under the age of 25, and this noise the mosquito makes young people feel sick. So very often this device is put up in bus shelters or sort of outside a parade of shops, somewhere where young people congregate in groups, what seem to constitute antisocial behavior. And in fact, the youth worker in Salford who'd first told me about the mosquito, I mean, it's now pretty common, but when I first heard about it a few years ago, it wasn't. She said, can you imagine if you put up a device which pierced the ears of black or disabled people? It would be seen to be totally against human rights. And in fact, this device is seen to be against human rights in a number of European countries which have banned it. But it was invented here in the UK. It's not an American innovation, but it's proved so successful that, in fact, the company which invented it has now been bought by an American company, and they're going to be rolling it out globally. So we're right at the forefront of this technology. And this is the latest of all. I mean, these things almost seem ridiculous, but they are totally part of the everyday environment now. These are the drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, which were initially used in military situations. They're used in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were modified for civilian use in Los Angeles in 2006. And they now fly over parts of Liverpool, parts of North Wales, and they will have a big presence during the Olympics. They will definitely be flying over Stratford City. They've already been trialled. So it's this sort of flying CCTV, which is now part of our everyday environment. And Liverpool, in fact, is one city which I think sort of illustrates where this paradox is in fact the starkest. Liverpool is one of the most defended places I've ever been to in the UK. You get off the train, the first thing you hear is a tannoy announcement saying that private security are policing the station. It's the first thing you hear. You come out of the station, you get in a taxi. There's actually CCTV in taxis in Liverpool. And then, of course, you've got the private security in Liverpool 1, and you've got the drones flying over deprived parts of the city. But Liverpool, actually, contrary to perceptions, is not a high-crime city. The crime figures in Liverpool are lower than in Leeds and Manchester, which are cities of comparable size. And in fact, crime in Liverpool is the second lowest in the region. And yet, the perception is that crime is very high in Liverpool, and fear of crime is indeed very high. So Liverpool is a classic example of a place where fear of crime, rather than crime itself, is a problem. And it just spirals. You know, the more security innovations are introduced, I would say, you know, the more you get this corrosive fear. I mean, the bottom line here is that fear of crime has no relationship, amazingly enough, unfortunately, really, because it would be much more straightforward if it did, but fear of crime has no relationship with actual crime. What fear of crime does correlate with, though, directly, is trust. And these high security, defensible space environments undermine trust, they undermine natural surveillance, and they therefore increase fear. And I think Denmark is a very good example here, because Denmark has very similar levels of crime to the UK, which is shown by the European Crime and Safety Survey to be a consequence of urbanization, a large population of young people, and a binge drinking culture. But Denmark is also the happiest country in the world and has very low levels of fear. Now, there are other factors in the mix as well, but I think this urban environment that we've created and this emphasis on security has got a role to play. And the sorts of things I've just been talking about are total anathema in Denmark, where open street CCTV is actually banned. I mean, the sort of arguments I'm trying to make is that fear is, well, it's a sort of self-evident truth that fear is linked to unhappiness. And I'm trying to say that the environment we live in impacts directly on the way we feel about ourselves and the way we feel about each other. And the US has twice the rate of mental illness as continental Europe, double. And in Britain, we're nearing levels approaching America, and we have similarly high rates of fear of crime. And yet, you know, we keep importing this American approach to living in our cities. And the final slide I have here is back to the arguments about democracy in the city as well. These places are owned and run by private companies, not democratically elected representatives, and we've substituted the public good for economic benefit. So, very gloomy picture that I've just presented. And when I started writing the book, I thought that we were inexorably actually following this path. And I couldn't see that it was at all likely that we would be doing things any differently. But then midway through writing the book, the financial crash happened and actually really raised a lot of questions about these places and about their economic viability, because this is the property-fueled model of looking at the city. It's what I describe as the architecture of boom and bust. And we've come to see that actually it's not just a political argument, a moral argument, an aesthetic argument, a social argument, but it's an economic argument. We need a more balanced economy than one which is dependent purely on property finance and retail, which is what we saw in the last 10 years or so. So, you know, suddenly I felt, you know, there was perhaps an opportunity for questioning, you know, the way that we were doing things. Well, I'll just talk very briefly just about the current context, just before I come to a close. I mean, I showed that first slide at the beginning of the centre of Liverpool, which was a construction site. This is the centre of Bradford, and this isn't the construction site, this is just a cleared site, and this was supposed to be another very large private place, which Westfield were going to be developing, and now it's just a hole in the ground. And this is far from the only city centre to have a stalled site at its heart. Basically, a lot of this development has simply stopped. So, I mean, I want to very quickly run over alternatives. I mean, as I said, there's no reason why we have to privatise our streets and public places. These are recent policies. They're very much an American approach to the city rather than a European approach to the city. And amazingly enough, I mean, at this stage in talking about the book over the last 6 months or so, I kind of find myself saying, yes, well, I have to praise Boris Johnson here, which is not really what I expected to be doing. But Boris wrote a manifesto for public space a year or so ago, where he said he no longer wishes private developments to privately control and manage the streets, and he wants local authorities to ensure that they continue to adopt streets and public places in the manner that we have been used to, which is great. But, you know, how much difference is it really going to make? The one development which is going ahead is Stratford City, which is linked to the Olympic development, that received all its planning permissions before Boris's manifesto, and that's going to be an enormous privatised place. So it's great that Boris has come out with this, but we've yet to see the fruits of it. So this slide here, this is a picture actually from New York. This is the High Line in New York, the former railroad. And this shows something of what you can do if you have a completely different way of looking at things, and if your city authority is prepared to sanction a completely different way of looking at things. You saw that slide of Bradford, the hole in the ground, just a minute ago. The High Line in New York has now been turned into an urban park, and it's an enormous success, a massive tourist attraction, and a total win-win situation. I mean, I'm not saying that every site should be turned into a park, but it just shows that, you know, if you're prepared to take an approach which isn't looking simply at economic benefit, and you're prepared to start looking at other ways of doing things, you could come up with all sorts of really interesting and unexpected ideas. I also like to quote this slide here from Jan Gehl, the Danish urbanist, who said 20 years ago when he asked people why they went to Copenhagen, they said they went to do their shopping. And today, 4 times as many people go to the centre of Copenhagen, but they just go to take in the city, and perhaps they'll shop on the side. So it's very much about creating the sort of place where you'll just linger, you know, you'll just hang out, you'll have chance encounters. It's the opposite of this controlled environment that I've been describing. And I mean, if we want to start looking at creating environments like that, you know, it's very much about looking at the importance of identity in places. And of course, it's important that areas are economically successful, but space has got to be more than a consumer product. And planning policy, as I've said repeatedly, is absolutely at the heart of this. You know, very often it's tiny things. I mean, why is a place like the Lanes in Brighton, why is that a little rabbit warren of such a successful, I mean, very cheesy and high-end, but it's a rabbit warren of little shops. Why is that? It's simply because the planning permission, you can't knock one space into another to create very large spaces. So often it's, you know, very tiny detailed policies which can change the character of an area. In the US, they've got campaigns in various cities to behind the importance of small independent businesses, which very often need subsidized rents. So campaigns such as Keep Portland Independent, Keep Austin Weird. You know, it's a sort of slightly different way of looking at what we want from our cities, rather than this sort of mallization of places. I mentioned Boris's manifesto for public space. That's a very, very positive recent development. It's not the only positive recent development. As many of you are probably aware, this whole idea of shared space has started to take off in recent years. I'll just go to this slide. This is a picture of shared space on Kensington High Street. And basically all the railings have been removed. And in fact, in continental Europe, where shared space hails from, they actually take the traffic lights out as well. But it's about removing all the controls from an environment. which initially, when it was mooted in Holland, people said, we can't possibly do that, it would be too dangerous. But actually what people found is if you remove all the traffic controls, places actually become safer because you get this natural surveillance. People start communicating with each other to create safer environments. So actually accident figures for places which use shared space have plummeted, and we have now started to import shared space into Britain. That was High Street Kensington, Exhibition Road is doing it, and it's really taking off all around the country. Now, if that argument applies to traffic controls, and that was a really big ask to get traffic engineers to accept that, and they have done, because the statistics are irrefutable. The same argument, I believe, applies to security as well. So I think the whole move towards shared space and the London Manifesto for Public Space, these are all very positive developments, and people have started to understand what it means to have privately owned and privately controlled places, and how this creates a far less democratic city and a far more fearful city. So on the one hand, I'd say lots of positive developments, lots of opportunities. Development is at a sort of crossroads, and things could go in all sorts of directions. But I have to say, the main message seems to be, let's get back to business as usual as soon as we possibly can. And that's what we hear in every sphere of our political lives, and this and architecture, development, construction is no different. And the main problem is, although we've got all these empty sites all around the country, I was asked to talk in Edinburgh by a group who have been championing an alternative use for the Coulton Gate site in Canongate, and they want to create a literary arts centre there. They've got hundreds of community activists involved in this project, and the local authority just refuses to sanction that sort of approach because they're still, totally on this economic benefit modelled. So although there are some temporary uses, we do have the odd urban park on some of our empty sites. Most of them are just stalled, awaiting to a return to business as usual. And I think, if that's the only approach that we can take, that's going to be an immensely squandered opportunity, because we do have a sort of window at the moment where, we can start to think about different ways of doing things. Sadly, as I said, the main landmark development in the UK, certainly in London over the next year or so, is the Olympics and Westfield's Stratford City, the Olympic Park Legacy Company. Both of those are entirely privatised developments, entirely privatised spaces, which received all their planning permissions before. I mean, it's interesting that, the main development, Boris could come out with this great policy after the main developments have already got the go-ahead. So it's disappointing that this is in fact the face we're going to show the world. Westfield Stratford City is going to be another, very sort of Canary Wharf type environment, and I would say it's kind of contrary to the ethics of the Olympic spirit to have this, very high security privatized space, but that's what we've got. So, what's the outlook? Well, I'd say mixed picture. On the one hand, lots of positive trends. On the other hand, what's going ahead is less so. The key thing I really always like to stress is just the importance of policy and how this notion of public good was very quietly substituted for economic benefit. And I think the more we start to talk about how important policy is, the more we're likely to be able to do something about it. And it's policy that Boris has, basically moved to change with his manifesto for public space. I think it's just essential that we learn from the mistakes of the architecture of boom and bust. Not only brought us it brought us the financial crisis, whether or not you take on board the arguments I've been making. It's essential we don't return to business as usual. Instead, we've got to look much more at the importance of the local economy, and in so doing, we will create places which have a far greater sense of identity and diversity, and in the process, we can strengthen, again, democracy, trust, and happiness. So, thank you.
you, Anna. Are there questions from the audience? Perhaps I can ask you something first.
Sure.
I think it's incredibly clear how you showed us how these oppressive urban environments are created. But I'm simply wondering why, in particular, is Britain so suitable for them, if opposed to, for example, Europe?
Yeah, I don't think it's that Britain is so suitable for them. I think it's our policymakers who very much like the idea of them. I mean, you know, we have a much more Atlanticist economy. Mm-hmm. You know, we import policies from the US in many spheres, but this is one central sphere where we've done that. I mean, I think what we saw over the last 10 years or so is that politicians would talk a lot about the urban renaissance and continental cafe-style culture and how we want to create this sort of, you know, French style, you know, Italian style piazza, this and that. But actually, all the policies they were importing were straight from the US. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think it's it's a far more Atlanticist way of turning to well, copy, I would say, rather than looking to our European counterparts. Although we borrow all the rhetoric from Europe, but I don't think there's anything innate about the British sort of psyche that likes these private places at all. Yeah. You know, in fact, when I talk about these places, people are invariably really shocked that this has quietly happened. Yeah.
And that's clear.
I mean, one other point, you know, one point I made in the talk quite a few times is that we're importing American policies, but actually again and again we seem to be going so much further than they are. Yeah. And that's for a number of reasons. But I mean, whatever one may say about American policy, their constitution is really fantastic, and it's inherently so much more democratic than our own system, that actually these things get picked up much more quickly and develop into big cause célèbres over there, where here they're just completely, you know, not seen to at all.
Is that a constitutional thing?
I think the constitution and local democracy is absolutely central. Yeah, and I mean it's a very different system here from in the US.
I think we have a question from Hugo.
Thanks. I think it's a very persuasive argument, and it follows on from your book, which I think was an excellent documentation of this sort of critique. I suppose I've got two different questions. One is really about probably most of the people in this building. In other words, what can architects and planners do to start to push the argument back against their clients or against investors to say, actually, there is a more intelligent way of developing urban space? It's a very difficult argument to make when, as you point out, they're driven by economic reasons which are very powerful in the other direction. And then the other part of my question is really more about what the citizen might be able to do. You've referred a bit to the Constitution, the American model. Of course, we have in the UK, and particularly in London, the situation where the local government is the planning authority. So theoretically, there is very good democratic and reactive control of that planning authority. But as we know, it doesn't seem to work like that. So your reflections on how one could help, perhaps, from the professions, but also from citizens. You've referred to some citizens' action groups. And perhaps in parentheses, whether the figment of localism and the Localism Act is, in your opinion, in any way useful as a lever towards perhaps empowering more active discussion in the local government, or whether it's a fantasy.
Okay. All right. First of all, what can architects do? Well, I mean, I think I personally, you know, if I had my sort of dream wish list, you know, I'd say architects should be far higher up, have a far more prominent role in the whole development process than they do, unfortunately. You know, architects, I'm sure you agree. Architects are between a rock and a hard place, especially right now. You know, you really want the work, and if your client's telling you this is the work, what can an architect do? So, I mean, architects, I wish the system was such that architects had a far more prominent role, and you've been undermined systematically in the whole sort of design and build, and actually architects are quite often cut out entirely now. So it's very difficult to know what architecture can actually do, apart from have as much awareness of what they may be contributing to as they possibly can. I mean, I think, there are some practices which are doing some great schemes. There is some really great work going on, and I think that has to be highlighted and lauded by the profession much more. I mean, I was really relieved that the Sterling Prize did not go to Liverpool 1, because Liverpool 1 was on the shortlist for the Sterling Prize. Now, if they'd got it, that would have sent a certain sort of message. But, the profession, I don't know. I mean, I think you're doing everything that you can be doing. It's very hard to see how you can operate in a different context. I mean, planning is the other profession which has been systematically undermined to the point that it's been sort of virtually dismantled, which, again, if planning had a much more central role, one much more akin to what it's got in Europe, where, this concept of the public good is behind planning decisions, things would be very different. I mean, that leads me on, so I haven't really answered your what can architects do, because you know as much as I do on that. But talking about planning leads me on to your next question: what can citizens do? Well, planning is at the sort of interface of local democracy, the political process and these decisions. And it's the fact that planning has been so undermined. And local government is in a terrible state. I mean, we all know, what are turnouts at local elections. They're absolutely pitiful. I mean, I think a lot of what was coming out of the Tories in the run-up to the election with regard to planning, and you mentioned the localism bill, a lot of what they've been talking about with regard to planning has just sounded incredibly positive. That they were going to really be so much more democratic in their approach. But unfortunately, if you read their planning stuff and you think, this sounds brilliant, this is exactly what I would have wanted them to say. And then you read the beginning of the Tory manifesto, and there's a sentence there about how, economic benefit will be driving forward all development decisions in the area. And you're like, well, how do these two square together? It doesn't really work. So, I mean, what can people do? I mean, again, I think I'm afraid my answers are very weak. Apart from talk about it, debate it, get the issue out there as much as possible. But I think we've just got to be aware of what a bad way actually our local democracy is in. I mean, I think the fact that the Tories did take on board the need for a lot of this change in planning policies is very positive, but I don't think they're going to do it. So that's the negative part.
That leads to a question that I wanted to ask you. I like very much the way you kind of stopped gloominess at one point in your talk and then said, maybe there's a ray of light. I think something that's in the book, which you didn't do in the talk, which is this progression from, in a sense, policies invented by Mrs. Thatcher's government, which were then implemented really by New Labour. So I think this is something that people are pretty unaware of. I mean, they kind of still treat New Labour as if it was Labour in, 1960s. And I think, what are your thoughts about that? Because I think, the people power and people will discuss it more, and maybe there is a future in that. But there seems to be a sort of an endemic policy making that goes across the parties. That is just building up. So, I mean, your book is quite, to me, it shocked me when I read it at that level, that, so many of the things which I thought were implemented by the Conservative Party actually were implemented by New Labour categorically. So they were muted by the Conservatives, but then actually implemented by New Labour. Do you feel that obviously Boris, you're enamored with at the moment, but do you think that the coalition is going anywhere towards that, or do you think that we're selling the silver as usual?
The reason I didn't make those points about New Labour to the point which I do in the book, which is very much an attack on their urban policy, basically. I didn't make those points in the talk because we now have a new government, we have a different political context. I can't see that the picture is going to be that different. And I think what you said it holds true. I mean, there's a consensus really among both the parties that this property-led, retail-led investment model for city centres on a privatised model, you know, is the right way of doing things. I mean, that's a sort of a bigger policy. Smaller policies, smaller, I think is very important. Secured by design is absolutely part of the fabric for whichever administration is in power. I mean, lots of good stuff came out with the coalition agreement. I mean, I was really all for all the civil liberties stuff. You know, there was a really authoritarian tendency which we were witnessing before, and that seemed to improve a lot, and actually people started saying lots of great things about CCTV and removing lots of CCTV and the whole security approach, you know, we were sort of starting to look at again, and antisocial behaviour policies have been questioned again. You know, there was a little window of all sorts of interesting new things were happening. I'm not terribly hopeful that the coalition is going to be progressing these. I think if there's going to be energy, it's going to be from an unexpected place that none of us really know. You know, it's very hard to predict these things. I think there's a space here to do things differently, but I can't tell you where it's going to come from.
Are there more questions?
It seems to me from listening both to your talk and the two questioners here that there's a kind of naivety involved, that what you express is a breakdown of public trust and a breakdown of the function of democracy. On the one hand, there are policies, on the other hand, there are people, and the two don't relate at all. And yet, when I'm listening to you talk just a moment ago, you're talking the jargon of pamphlets handed out by political parties, which bear no relation to the kind of process we've seen going on for about 100 years, or say 50 years since the Second World War, which is a progressive loss of public control over the urban environment, which is your point, yeah? But it seems to me that we surely must recognise that the people who are controlling these events are not making mistakes. They're perfectly well aware of the kind of issues you're raising, but that the motives which drive them are of a different agenda. That is to say, they're short-term, they're about making profits for private individuals who have a great deal of power. And that unless you can address the issue of how we change that by making the democracy more accountable, it's a waste of time even discussing it. You know, I know that sounds terrible, but I think that's the scale of the crisis we're facing. And that we really ought to face it on that level. That is, the political parties are becoming more uniform in this country, as one of the questioners just said, precisely because they are controlled by exactly the same interests. That's why we don't have real political parties. That's why the Labour Party has carried on, or New Labour has carried on, the same policies as the previous Conservative government. And we shouldn't pretend anymore to be interested in manifestos that these people produce, because they're actually deceptions, which you pointed out so quite eloquently a moment ago. So this really needs addressing at the level of politics.
Well,
not at the level we're at.
I mean, what I was trying to do with the book, I suppose, was just take one window onto a wider picture, I guess. You know, and I was looking at the urban environment and how the architecture of a certain period, the contemporary period, reflects a lot of many wider issues about how we're living today. And so, I mean, of course, you know, we are talking about a spectrum of much, much wider issues, but I was just trying to illuminate them by just talking about the urban environment, and that was a sort of way into highlighting a sort of a far wider picture. I mean, I think it's easier probably to go in on a sort of more focused part of the picture and to start to make your points that way, rather than to just say, right, you know, I've got this huge sort of political crisis I'm facing. You don't know, you know, you've got to sort of focus in and then kind of grow with your picture. if that makes any sense.
Thank you. I'm an American, and I'm a city planner by profession. And one of the problems we have is that we allow a lot of suburban auto-oriented development outside of the center city that saps the vitality of our center cities. And we have movements like Keep Austin Weird and things like that that try to, limit, those kind of, chain stores and things like that, and national chain stores in our city centers. But we have a court system that treats the big boys just like anybody else, and they usually prevail. I look at England or at the UK and see, gee, aren't they lucky they've kept their, their main shopping cores in the center city. They haven't siphoned it off to a suburban, complex with acres and acres of parking. So I, at first, thought, these are great, but you've opened my eyes and see that they have a lot of things going against them. The kind of the, just the, I guess the spiral of, you think you're safe, but you're really not safe, and these, I never noticed all the CCTVs, but I guess they're there, but my initial reaction was, this is great. They can have the Asdas and the big stores in their city, and that's better than what we have, which is got to get in the car and go way out to the mall to get anything.
Yeah.
But
I'm not saying no Asda in the centre of the city, no Sainsbury's, no Tesco's. I mean, it's not a sort of argument against any corporate development at all. It's just this one template for doing things that I was trying to highlight. But I mean, Britain, for all the failings of the planning system, we do have a much more interventionist planning system than you do in the US. I mean, you kind of virtually don't have one at all. So,
not when the courts get involved.
Yeah.
Well, the only other thing I could say is that, we have and are just starting to get things like what we call defensible space, which I guess you call security by design and stuff like that. And, that is a real human kind of gut reaction basic thing. And it could be done well, and it can be done poorly. And you've shown some good examples of it being done very poorly. But I still think it's something that planners still ought to try to do, and architects still ought to try to do, is incorporate some defensible, use what we call defensible space, incorporate safety and security in actual physical design of places.
Well, I mean, we could get into that whole secured by design, defensible space argument. I mean, these are actually originally American ideas. Oscar Newman popularized them in the early 70s, and secured by design comes straight from Oscar Newman's thinking. And he pioneered these ideas, and I think it was in some particularly violent projects in New York. So these ideas, which grew up in particularly deprived parts of New York, became the template for how we look at security in cities. But I mean, we probably don't have time to enter into the argument too much right now. But I think we have to be very careful with secured by design and defensible space, not to actually undermine natural surveillance and the way we keep people, the way we collectively keep places safe. And I think that's the issue. I mean, I'm not saying people don't go into these things with the best motives in the world, thinking, we have to incorporate safety and security, but very often, the results are quite counterintuitive.
We have one last point.
Last point is a compliment to your book, actually, in answer to the gentleman at the back. I think what is brilliant the way that you've written is that you are not an architect or an urban planner, and by showing us the underhand way in which actually the city has transformed itself in the last 15 years, it has actually opened a can of worms as to what's happened politically in the country. And I think that's the strength of the book. I think if you were an urbanist or an architect having written the book, the criticism might hold. But the fact that you're not, and that someone like me who spent the last 20 years worrying about London and about the issues that you talk about, I was enlightened by your book, because what it showed me was that even I, who've been working on it, wasn't quite aware of some of the acts that have taken place and some of the changes that have taken place. So I think that's the strength of what you're trying to do, and I think maybe that does show a way forward, because at the beginning you said that you respected the sort of technocrats in a way, and you didn't want to sort of, i.e., you know, the kind of the experts, that you were talking from outside the experts.
Oh, I see, right.
I think the strength of the book is actually that it's very appealing to the experts, but it's not coming from the experts. And therefore I think its strength is that it reveals the underlying political issues, and I think that's a compliment. I think that's the way it should be.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That's absolutely fantastic. Before you all go off, I'd just like to point out that the AA bookshop is here with Anna's book for sale for a special price of $9.95, and Anna will be available for signatures. Thank you all for coming.